Christmas 1995. Sandringham House, Norfolk. The windows were fogged with cold. Outside, the grounds were iron hard with frost, the kind that doesn't lift until February. Inside, the fire in the drawing room had been burning since morning. The royal family had gathered as they always gathered at Christmas, in the same rooms, around the same table, under the same unspoken rules that governed everything in that house: speak carefully, feel privately, perform seamlessly. Diana was there. She was 34 years old. She had been Princess of Wales for 14 years. The separation from Charles had been official for 3. The Panorama interview, the one where she had sat in front of 23 million viewers and said there were 3 of us in this marriage, had aired 6 weeks earlier. The palace had not recovered. Charles had not recovered. And at some point during those Christmas days, in a room that was not designed for confrontation, but became one anyway, something happened that nobody inside the family expected. The Queen spoke. Not to a courtier, not through a private secretary. Not in the layered diplomatic language the palace used when it wanted to signal displeasure without creating a record. She spoke in the room, in front of her family, and what she said, documented across multiple first-hand accounts preserved by royal biographers with direct access to palace insiders, was not what Charles had expected to hear. We are going to come back to exactly what was said. But first, you need to understand what Diana had already endured in the 6 weeks between Panorama and that Christmas gathering, because the institutional pressure placed on her in that window was not subtle. It was designed to break her. November 20th, 1995. The Panorama interview broadcast. Diana sat across from Martin Bashir in her sitting room at Kensington Palace. She wore a dark jacket. Her eyes were lined deliberately. She had chosen the look herself, understanding that the camera would either confirm her instability or reveal her composure, and she intended to control which one the world received. She spoke for 55 minutes. She named Camilla. She described the bulimia. She said she had self-harmed. She said the palace had tried to have her declared mentally unstable. She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts, if not a queen in a constitutional sense. She said she did not go quietly. That last phrase was not accidental. Within 48 hours, the palace machinery had mobilized. Charles's supporters began briefing journalists that the interview was an act of psychological warfare. Senior courtiers described it, in off-the-record conversations that later became public, as the most damaging single event in the monarchy's modern history. The Queen watched the interview at Windsor. What she said privately afterward was not recorded. What is documented is what she did next. She did not call Diana to reprimand her. She did not instruct her press office to issue a distancing statement. She did not give Charles's advisors the open endorsement they were expecting. She wrote Diana a letter. The letter was private. Its full contents were never published. But its existence and the general nature of its tone was confirmed by sources close to Diana and later referenced in multiple authorized accounts. The Queen did not condemn the interview. She expressed concern. She expressed something that, coming from a woman of her generation and position, required considerable private effort to put on paper. She expressed sympathy. Charles was not copied. To understand what the Queen did at Christmas, you need to understand the position she occupied between Diana and Charles for the entirety of the marriage. She was not Diana's ally. Let that be stated plainly. The Queen had not always protected her daughter-in-law. She had not always understood her. She had, at various points across the 1980s, been frustrated by Diana's relationship with the press, baffled by her visibility, and privately convinced that the emotional volatility Diana expressed was something that should be managed rather than listened to. She was also not simply Charles's champion, because what the Queen had, above all else, above personal loyalty, above family feeling, was a clear and unsentimental understanding of what the monarchy needed in order to survive. And by Christmas 1995, what she understood was this: Charles had made decisions that were endangering the institution, not because he had loved Camilla, not because the marriage had failed, but because of how all of it had been handled. The secrecy, the denial, the years of requiring Diana to perform in public while withholding from her in private, the briefings against her, the sustained, coordinated effort to reframe her distress as instability. The British public had watched Panorama. They had not come away convinced that Diana was unstable. They had come away convinced that she was telling the truth. The Queen understood the difference. Charles, surrounded by advisors who had spent 3 years telling him what he wanted to hear, did not. Christmas at Sandringham operated according to rituals so established they had become indistinguishable from law. The family attended church at St. Mary Magdalene on Christmas morning. They exchanged gifts on Christmas Eve in the German tradition. They gathered for meals in particular rooms at particular times. Rank, precedence, and positioning were not discussed. They were simply understood by everyone present and performed without instruction. What this meant, in practice, was that any deviation from the expected order of things was immediately visible. There was no ambient noise to absorb it. There were no strangers present to dilute it. When something unusual happened inside those walls, every person in the room registered it. The conversation that became the subject of later testimony happened in the presence of senior family members. The exact trigger has been described slightly differently across accounts. Some place it after a remark made about Diana's future role. Others after a reference to the Panorama interview and what needed to happen next. What every account agrees on is the direction of what followed. Charles had positioned himself in the family discussion as the wronged party, as the husband who had endured public humiliation, as the man whose wife had gone to the press, had spoken openly, dangerously, without palace sanction and damaged everything around her. The Queen listened, and then she spoke. She did not raise her voice. People who knew the Queen well understood that she never needed to. Her authority in a room was not produced by volume. It was produced by the absolute certainty, shared by everyone present, that her words were not preliminary to a decision. They were the decision. What she said, documented in the accounts of multiple royal biographers, with access to sources who were present or had direct knowledge, amounted to this: Diana had been treated badly. Not in those exact words. The Queen did not use the language of emotion. She did not speak in the vocabulary of therapy or grievance or modern psychological framing. She spoke in the language she had always used: precise, considered, controlled, and within that language, she made clear that Diana's actions were understandable given what Diana had experienced. She made clear that Diana had been failed. And in doing so, in that room, in front of the family, she placed responsibility for that failure in a direction that everyone present understood immediately. Charles said nothing for a moment that multiple sources have described as visibly prolonged. He had not expected this to be clear about what the Queen did and did not do. She did not endorse the Panorama interview. She had, in fact, been deeply troubled by it. Not primarily because of what Diana said, but because Diana had given it without palace consultation, without warning the institution, without allowing anyone to prepare a response. That breach of protocol was, in the Queen's understanding of the world, a serious matter. She did not take Diana's side against the monarchy. What she did was more precise, and in its precision, more devastating to Charles. She distinguished between what Diana had done and why Diana had done it. She said, in effect, the method was wrong, but the reasons were not invented. That is not a small distinction inside a family that had spent 3 years insisting that Diana's distress was self-manufactured, that had briefed journalists through intermediaries that she was unstable, that had created a sustained institutional narrative in which everything Diana described was a symptom of her psychology rather than a response to her circumstances. The Queen had just said, in her precise and controlled way, that the narrative was wrong. Charles had built that narrative. Diana had described the Queen in private recordings with a complexity that the tabloid version of their relationship never captured. She had said the Queen was not warm. She had said communication between them was difficult. She had said that on several occasions when she had tried to speak to her mother-in-law about what was happening inside the marriage, she had come away feeling that she had not quite reached her. But she had also said something else. She had said, "I always felt she tried, in her own way. I think she found me difficult to understand, but I don't think she meant to be unkind." That is not a vindication of the Queen's handling of Diana. It is something more honest than vindication. Is Diana, who had every reason to cast the entire institution as uniformly hostile, refusing to flatten the people inside it into simple villains. She had done the same in the Panorama interview when she said she did not expect Charles to be king. She had added, "But I think he is a good father." Diana consistently refused to make the story as simple as the people around her needed it to be. That, more than anything else, was what made her dangerous to those who wanted to control the narrative. You cannot easily discredit someone who refuses to exaggerate their own grievances. What happened to Charles in the months that followed Sandringham was a slow, careful, institutional recalibration. The Queen began making decisions that signalled, clearly enough for those inside the palace to read, that the approach Charles's advisors had taken toward Diana was not going to be continued with her full support. In December 1995, she wrote to both Charles and Diana recommending, in unusually direct terms for a monarch, that they divorce. The letters were private. Their existence was later confirmed by multiple sources. The Queen did not wait for mediation, for another round of negotiations, for another year of managed tension. She said, this should end now, and it should end properly. What properly meant, in terms of Diana's title, her finances, her access to the boys, her future role, was fiercely contested in the 18 months that followed. Charles's advisors wanted Diana stripped of the HR designation. The Queen's position was more complicated. She eventually agreed to the removal of the title, a decision that Diana experienced as a final institutional diminishment. Diana said afterward that losing the HRH was the cruelest part, not because of the title itself, but because of what removing it said about the years she had given. The Queen did not reverse that decision. but she had spoken at Christmas, and in a family where almost nothing was said directly that had been heard. There is a photograph taken of the Queen and Diana together at a public engagement in the early 1990s. They are standing side by side. Diana is taller. They are not touching. Their expressions are correct, ceremonially neutral, trained into composure by years of practice. Nothing in the photograph suggests warmth. Nothing in the photograph suggests hostility either. What the photograph captures, without knowing it, is the essential nature of their relationship. Two women inside the same institution, bound by different rules, reading each other with different instruments, reaching for communication across a distance that neither of them had designed and neither of them could simply dissolve. Diana had wanted more from the Queen than the Queen was able, or had been trained, to give. The Queen had understood more about Diana's situation than Charles's advisors were comfortable acknowledging. At Christmas 1995, in a room in Sandringham, with her family gathered and her son waiting for agreement that never came, the Queen had briefly, clearly without theatrical emphasis, said what she understood. Diana was not imagining it. Charles had not expected those words. He had believed, as people often believe when they have been the subject of coordinated institutional support for long enough, that agreement was a given, that the weight of rank and loyalty and institutional self-interest would produce, as it usually did, a closing of ranks. It did not. The fire burned in the drawing room. The frost was still on the grounds. The family finished Christmas as Christmas is always finished in that house, correctly, ceremonially, without outward disruption, but something had shifted. And the woman who had spent 14 years being told, in 100 different institutional languages, that what she perceived was not what was real, she was not there to hear it. She did not need to be. The Queen had said it in a room full of people who would remember. That was enough.